It was the 1st of April, 1944, a date that should have been remembered for spring's quiet renewal. Instead, it became a day when peace and war collided in the most tragic misunderstanding of the Second World War. Over the calm rooftops of Schaffhausen, a Swiss town nestled against the German border, the hum of engines began to swell in the sky. People looked up, expecting perhaps another wave passing overhead toward Germany, something that had become almost routine. But that morning, the rumble didn't fade. It grew louder, thicker, until the air itself began to shake. No alarm sounded. No anti-aircraft guns roared. Switzerland was neutral. The citizens had nothing to fear, or so they thought.
Alert the General Staff now.
Far above them, at 20,000 feet, a formation of U.S. 8th Air Force B-24 Liberators streaked through the thick cloud. Their mission? Bomb the industrial plants of Ludwigshafen, Germany. But the sky had turned against them. Winds from the north blew stronger than predicted. Cloud cover blanketed the Rhine like a shroud. Navigational radar in the lead Pathfinder aircraft failed. When the crew recalculated their position, they were already drifting dozens of miles off course into Swiss airspace. The instruments said Germany. The truth said otherwise.
If we hold this position, the supply lines
Inside
remain
the lead bomber, Lieutenant Robert L. Foster tapped his maps, tracing the river below. He saw what looked like a bend of the Rhine, a line of rails, a patch of factory roofs, exactly what he expected near Ludwigshafen. He gave the order. This is the target. Bomb bay doors opened. 60 tons of high explosives fell through the clouds toward a town that had never joined the war. At 9:40 a.m., the earth of Schaffhausen erupted. Factories, homes, and trains disintegrated in an instant. Flames rolled across the streets. Church bells cracked under the heat. By the time silence returned, 40 citizens were dead, hundreds wounded, and a neutral nation stood staring at the wreckage left by its supposed protectors. What followed was not only a question of blame, but of conscience. How could those fighting for freedom destroy a land that refused to fight at all? The men who dropped the bombs never meant to. They were exhausted, flying blind, and clinging to instruments that betrayed them. For the 8th Air Force, missions over Germany had become increasingly desperate. The Reich's industries had to be crippled before D-Day. Factories at Ludwigshafen and Mannheim were prime targets, their chemical production feeding Hitler's war machine. Each mission meant threading through flak, fighters, and freezing skies. And that morning, April 1, was no different. The formation had departed from airfields in eastern England before dawn. The air crews carried no maps of Switzerland. They weren't supposed to need them. In briefing, commanders repeated the mantra, "Identify your target or abort." But up in the clouds, visibility was zero. Radio silence held. When the lead aircraft's radar failed, the rest followed it by faith alone. At 20,000 feet, over a sea of white, there was no Germany, no Switzerland, only the illusion of direction. At 9:30, the lead bombardier spotted a break in the cloud. Below, a railway yard, a river curve, a cluster of chimneys, the perfect profile of an industrial German city. He called the mark. The order rippled through the formation. Bomb bay doors opened, each aircraft releasing its deadly cargo. Seconds later, the first explosions tore into Schaffhausen's northern quarter. One of the bombs struck a train loaded with fuel, another hit a textile factory. Fire and shrapnel devoured entire streets. In less than 5 minutes, a neutral city was gone. When the crews turned back toward England, they didn't know. They believed they had done their duty, but radio intercepts reached London within hours. Switzerland was in flames. The red and white flag of neutrality was burning. What had been a strategic strike became an international crisis. For the first time in the war, America's greatest air arm had bombed a friendly nation, and the world was watching. When the smoke lifted over Schaffenhausen, the world seemed to hold its breath. Fires crackled where gardens once bloomed. Streets that had echoed with the rhythm of bicycles and market chatter now lay split open by craters. A child's shoe dangled from a shattered window. The town clock had frozen at 9:42 a.m. Swiss fire brigades and volunteers rushed from nearby villages, dragging hoses through glass and rubble, dousing what was left of a city that had never even fired a shot. Doctors worked in basements because the hospitals were burning. Priests tore their cassocks to make bandages. And amid the confusion, people whispered the same question. Why us? Switzerland had been neutral for centuries, a mountain fortress surrounded by chaos, but committed to staying apart from it. The government in Bern had warned both Axis and Allied powers repeatedly, respect our airspace. And yet, for months, Allied bombers had crossed those borders, chasing targets along the Rhine. Until Schaffenhausen, the violations were tolerated, accidents in the fog of war. But now, there were bodies in the streets and an unmistakable truth. Neutrality was no shield against error. Swiss President Marcel Pilet-Galaz convened an emergency cabinet meeting within hours. Messages were sent to London and Washington demanding an explanation. For a nation built on diplomacy, the question cut deep. Could neutrality survive when even its friends could not see it from the sky?
Newspapers across Europe printed the images, a neutral city flattened by American bombs. Berlin's propaganda machine leapt on the story, declaring that the so-called champions of democracy had murdered innocents. German radio even claimed the bombing was deliberate, meant to intimidate Switzerland into joining the Allies. Inside the U.S. Embassy in Bern, diplomats scrambled to verify what had gone wrong. Telegrams poured in from survivors describing the metal rain that had fallen from a cloudless sky. Within a single morning, America's image as liberator had been shadowed by a mistake that no apology could easily erase. News of the bombing reached Washington before noon. In the War Department, stunned silence filled the briefing room as messages from Switzerland arrived one after another. Damage reports, casualty lists, aerial photos showing smoking ruins. General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the U.S. Air Forces, read the first dispatch twice before speaking. "This can't be right," he murmured. But it was. The coordinates showed the truth. The formation that was supposed to hit Ludwigshafen had veered 40 miles south into neutral territory. A simple wind miscalculation had become an international disaster. President Franklin D. Roosevelt demanded an immediate investigation. No one wanted to believe that American airmen, the same men hailed as heroes over Europe, had bombed a friendly nation. But military logic could not undo the moral weight of the act. The Swiss had lost 40 lives. Dozens more were missing beneath rubble. For a neutral country that had spent 4 years walking the razor's edge between Hitler and the Allies, it was a humiliation they would not forget.
In London, Allied diplomats scrambled for damage control. The British Foreign Office drafted a note of deep regret, while U.S. Ambassador Leland Harrison prepared to deliver a formal apology in Bern. Yet apologies in wartime were fragile things, spoken in one language, translated into another, and judged by photographs no translation could soften. Roosevelt personally authorized a payment of $4 million in reparations, an enormous sum for 1944, hoping money might at least rebuild what bombs had destroyed. But in military circles, The question went beyond guilt. It was about fear. If one error could ignite neutral outrage, what would happen when thousands of bombers filled Europe's skies for D-Day? How could the Allies claim moral authority if even their navigational mistakes killed the innocent? Behind closed doors, the phrase Schaffenhausen became shorthand for what every commander dreaded, a mission that hit the wrong map square and scarred the right side of history. The truth reached the airmen days later, carried not by command but by rumor. In their barracks back in England, crews of the 392nd Bomb Group heard whispers that they had bombed a neutral country. At first they laughed it off. The 8th Air Force hit industrial targets every week, and mistakes were part of the grind. But when the official debrief came, the laughter vanished. Maps were spread across the tables, and the navigator's finger traced the fatal drift of wind that had carried them south into Switzerland. Photos of Schaffenhausen, its blackened train yard, the ruined factories, the lines of coffins, were laid out in silence. Many of the men stared without speaking. They had faced flak and fighters, but none had expected to kill civilians who weren't even part of the war. One bombardier wrote in his log that night, "I thought we were freeing Europe. Now I wonder if we've just buried a piece of it." Officers tried to soften the blow. They explained the weather errors, the broken radar, the faulty bearings. They reminded the crews that no pilot drops bombs out of malice. But war's logic offered little comfort. The same precision that won battles could also destroy the innocent. Commanders banned talk of the incident on base. Morale could not afford guilt. Yet guilt came anyway, creeping into the quiet moments before takeoff. Every time clouds swallowed the horizon, someone remembered Schaffhausen. In the air, they flew straighter, double-checked coordinates, and prayed the wind would not betray them again. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence sent investigators to the wreckage. They interviewed Swiss witnesses, mapped every crater, cataloged bomb fragments stamped with American serial numbers. The evidence left no doubt it was a U.S. mission gone astray. The investigators' report would later describe it in a single phrase, a tragic consequence of overcast skies and human faith in instruments. Those words, stripped of emotion, masked a deeper truth, that in a war fought by machines, even neutrality could be erased by a single wrong calculation.
In Bern, Swiss officials were furious but careful. Their neutrality had always been a balancing act, trading with both sides, sheltering refugees, and surviving between powers that could crush them. Now they had to decide whether to confront the Allies or risk appearing weak before Berlin. President Pilet-Golaz ordered a full inquiry, summoning eyewitnesses from Schaffhausen and military observers from every canton. Swiss engineers measured blast radii. Chemists tested bomb fragments to confirm origin. Within days, their report was ready, precise as a Swiss watch. The attackers were American, not German, not British, American. The Swiss Foreign Ministry drafted a protest note that read less like outrage and more like a moral lecture. It reminded Washington that neutrality was not ignorance, it was courage. The courage to stand apart while the world burned. The note ended with a single sentence that cut deeper than any accusation. The tragedy of Schaffhausen proves that even friends must sometimes fear their allies. When Ambassador Leland Harrison delivered America's apology, he faced rows of Swiss delegates dressed in mourning black. His voice shook as he read Roosevelt's words of regret. He spoke of human error, of deep sorrow, of America's respect for Swiss independence. Outside the embassy, civilians gathered silently with photos of the dead. Some accepted the apology with stoic dignity, others turned away. For them, no money could rebuild what had been lost, a sense that neutrality itself could still mean safety. In the weeks that followed, the United States paid reparations, and Swiss newspapers cautiously acknowledged the gesture. But trust was harder to restore than buildings. Each Allied bomber that crossed their skies afterward was tracked by anti-air batteries, and Swiss pilots patrolled with orders to intercept anyone who strayed too close. The bombing of Schaffhausen had changed something fundamental. It proved that even in neutrality, no one could truly stay untouched by war. The bombing of Schaffhausen sent ripples far beyond the Swiss border. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry wasted no time turning tragedy into opportunity. Within hours of the attack, German radio stations broadcast grim reports describing the grim American terror raid on peaceful Switzerland. Newspapers printed doctored photos of burning cities and captions calling the Allies butchers of neutrality. For a population already hardened by years of Allied bombing, the story struck a nerve. It wasn't about sympathy for Switzerland, but about vindication. If even the neutral Swiss could be bombed, the Germans reasoned, then no one in Europe was safe from Allied arrogance.
But the truth was more complicated. Inside Allied headquarters in London, officers knew how fragile their moral position had become. Every raid had to prove that democracy could fight cleanly, that the cause of freedom didn't come at the expense of innocent lives. The incident over Schaffhausen was a reminder of how easily that image could crack. British officials worried the event might push Switzerland closer to Germany, or worse, compromise the delicate intelligence networks the Allies maintained across Swiss territory. Through Zurich's banks and consulates, secret information flowed daily. Spy exchanges, coded messages, smuggled photographs. If those doors closed, the Allies would lose one of their most valuable backchannels into Nazi-occupied Europe. Meanwhile, inside Switzerland, citizens debated what neutrality now meant. Some demanded that their army shoot down any foreign plane, Allied or Axis, that crossed their skies. Others argued that forgiveness was the wiser path. Switzerland's survival depended on balance, not vengeance. In Schaffhausen itself, funerals stretched on for days. Families buried their loved ones in simple wooden coffins draped in the red flag with the white cross. Church bells tolled not only for the dead, but for the end of an illusion that a borderline could stop a bomb. From afar, Roosevelt followed the developments closely. He knew that in the coming months, tens of thousands of bombers would pass near Swiss airspace again on their way to destroy Germany's industrial heart. A single misstep could reignite the crisis. To prevent another Schaffhausen, new directives were issued. No bombing without positive visual identification, no target runs through cloud cover near neutral borders, and navigators were now required to study detailed maps of Switzerland, a land they once thought irrelevant to war. Yet, even with precautions, accidents continued. In the months after Schaffhausen, Allied bombers again strayed into Swiss skies. Zurich and Basel suffered smaller, though still deadly strikes. Each time the Allies expressed regret, and each time the Swiss government accepted the apology. But the tone grew colder. For Swiss civilians, the word accident had lost its meaning. To them, every bomb was deliberate once the first had fallen. By late 1944, Schaffhausen had begun to rebuild. The charred remains of its factories were cleared, its homes reconstructed with bricks imported from unbombed cantons. Yet scars remained visible everywhere. In the pock-marked church towers, in the warped rails along the train line, in the eyes of survivors who flinched at every rumble of engines overhead. The town's museum later preserved fragments of those days, a twisted propeller, a melted alarm bell, the burnt casing of a bomb fuse stamped with American numbers. It was not hatred they displayed, but memory, a silent reminder that neutrality comes at a cost. In America, the story faded quickly from headlines, buried under the triumphs of Normandy and the race toward Berlin. For most, Schaffhausen became a footnote in the chaos of war. But among diplomats and pilots, it never disappeared. Inside the U.S. Army Air Forces, the word became a quiet warning used in mission briefings. Check your bearings, or you'll make another Schaffhausen. It was a lesson in humility, a scar carved into the conscience of a nation that prided itself on precision.
When Allied representatives visited Switzerland again after the war, they were met with civility, but not warmth. Swiss leaders accepted reparations totaling nearly $15 million for all accidental bombings. But behind every handshake was a shared understanding that no sum could repay the moral debt. The tragedy of Schaffhausen had shown the world something profound, that even those fighting tyranny could, in the fog of war, wound innocence itself. When the war finally ended in 1945, Switzerland stood largely intact, while cities across Europe lay in ruins. But for Schaffhausen, victory elsewhere meant little. Its citizens had lived through their own private apocalypse, one delivered not by an enemy, but by allies of peace. The reconstruction began almost immediately, powered by Swiss precision and pride. Volunteers from every canton arrived to help clear debris. Masons and carpenters worked from dawn to dusk, rebuilding walls that had collapsed in seconds. By the following year, trains once again passed through the city, and smoke rose from new chimneys. Yet the memories clung to the people, like the dust that never quite left their streets. In homes rebuilt on bombed foundations, families told and retold the story of that morning. Mothers described how the sunlight turned red. Men spoke of running through fire to pull neighbors from rubble. And somewhere in every retelling, a question lingered. How could they not see us? Generations later, that question still echoed in classrooms and memorial halls. Schaffhausen became a lesson for children about the fragility of peace, how it can shatter not from hatred, but from human error.
American and Swiss delegations met again in 1946 to formally close the case. The U.S. expressed renewed regret, acknowledging the event as one of the gravest mistakes of the Allied air campaign. But in their words lay another unspoken truth. In total war, even good intentions can become weapons. Swiss diplomats accepted the apology, and the two nations continued their friendship. But trust, once cracked, never fully returns to its shape. Decades later, when former American pilots visited Schaffhausen, they were received not with anger, but with silence. Many wept as they stood before the memorial stone near the train station, engraved with the names of 40 civilians and a single line in German. Hier fiel der Friede vom Himmel. Here, peace fell from the sky. It was not an accusation, but a lament. A reminder that even in victory, there are moments that humble the powerful and honor the innocent. Today, Schaffhausen is a quiet, prosperous city again. Its rivers run clear, its factories hum with life, and its church bells ring across valleys once scarred by war. Few visitors know that beneath the cobblestones lie fragments of American bomb casings, sealed under layers of time. The scars remain buried, yet they whisper to anyone who listens. Every year, on the anniversary of the bombing, townspeople gather in the square. There are no flags, no anthems, only a moment of silence, a small act of remembrance for a day when neutrality could not save them from the sky. In the archives of the U.S. Air Force, the mission report for April 1, 1944 still exists. Pages yellowed, stamped classified, later annotated with a single word, error. To historians, it's a footnote in a war filled with horrors. To the people of Schaffhausen, it was a reminder that in modern warfare, precision is an illusion, and every map can lie. The clouds that morning had not cared about borders, and neither had the bombs. Yet out of tragedy came something enduring, a bond forged through remorse and resilience. Switzerland never turned its neutrality into isolation. It continued to mediate conflicts, to offer asylum, to remind nations that even in the worst of times, humanity must hold its line. And for the airmen who lived long enough to see peace, the memory of that morning never left them. Some wrote letters to the town decades later, seeking forgiveness not from governments, but from the ghosts of those they never meant to harm. In the end, Schaffhausen's story isn't just about a mistake. It's about the price of being human in a mechanical war. It's about how a single gust of wind can alter the fate of nations, how technology meant to save civilization can wound it instead, and how forgiveness, though imperfect, is still the bravest act left after history misfires. For those who listen closely, the echo of those bombers still passes overhead, not as thunder, but as a warning. Even in clear skies, peace is fragile, and the line between justice and tragedy is only as wide as a cloud.